There we go. All righty. Well, welcome back to Toowoomba Forward. I'm your host, Tim Entwistle, and joining me right now is candidate for the Greens for the federal seat of Groom, Alyce Nelligan. Alyce, great to have you here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Tim.
Thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to have you here. Now, I wanted to start by just giving you a chance to introduce yourself and explain why you're running for the seat of Groom, and explain exactly why you believe that you will represent the needs of Groom better than any other candidate.
Well, I'm a disability advocate and community advocate by trade, essentially. And I think sometimes when we use terms like that, it seems very vague, but actually I do a lot of work fighting in that administrative review tribunal, helping people get their NDIS or Centrelink decisions overturned. I run workshops to help women with disabilities to start their own business, so I'm doing lots of fighting, lots of community work, and I think that puts me in good stead to be a leader for our community. And so I'm back this time because I feel like in my work I'm seeing more people struggling to access regular GPs or specialist care in the region, to access good mental health services. People are struggling to afford things like dental care, and so I really care about cost of living, and so I'm here to fight for us again.
Great. Thank you, Alyce. Now, moving to campaign strategy and what you're doing to reach voters this election, what does it mean to create a future for all of us, as the Greens quite boldly states, and how have the major parties not achieved this up to this point?
Look, that's a really great question. I think that essentially it just means that we're focusing on those foundational things that I think that the major parties have just forgotten about.
Sure.
They'll give a little bit here and a little bit there. And to Labor's credit, they have done some work on social housing. They have made the urgent care clinics, they're putting some funding towards these things. But when you look on the whole, and especially in regions like ours, we just miss out on so many essential things. And so that's what we stand for: getting back to basics, making sure that everyone has a house, a roof over their head, that they can afford the groceries, that they can see good quality health services and have their basic needs met, essentially.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. Just specifically in Groom, what are some of the things that people in Groom are missing out on in that regard that you think the Greens will be able to sort of address?
Well, for a start, obviously we don't have enough funding for domestic violence services in the region. We had the Larissa Waters up here last week talking about where we would put funding specifically to make sure that everybody could access emergency housing and domestic violence services. Obviously, health services, we want to make sure that there's more GPs in the region and that you can actually visit the GP for free, because we know that's the biggest barrier. Obviously, we would look at the new Toowoomba Hospital if I was elected here, because we need to have robust local medical services. As a disabled person, I have to travel to Brisbane quite frequently for my services, or use telehealth, which we should be able to have those services here. So, that's where we're focusing this time.
Sure. Appreciate that. Thank you. Now, I want to talk about specifically how the Greens is tackling probably the biggest sticking point, at least in an electorate like Groom, which is the fact that Groom is a conservative stronghold, and it has been for a very long time, and obviously hasn't changed hands in leadership for 120 something years. Unfortunately, what comes with that is that there is and I should say, unfortunately for the Greens campaign, that does mean that there's a large contingent of voters that hold a negative view of the Greens because of what they perceive to be the policies that grow government control and get involved in more areas of their lives. So how would you convince voters in Groom that you will represent their views, which have historically leaned towards, conservative social values, free market principles, and limited government?
I think that's a really great question. I think the disconnect between what a Greens representative and what we stand for and what voters, especially in conservative areas, there's a big disconnect. And I think it's actually through meeting with them, having one-on-one conversations, and being able to actually talk about our policies that is really helpful.
Mm.
People, I often joke, I don't drink lattes, I drink cappuccinos. People have a perception of us that just isn't necessarily accurate. So I think my background probably helps. So I'm from a farming family. I'm a farmer's daughter. The high heels might be pretty, but they've been in sheep poo before. I certainly come from that working class background. My dad was in unions. My mum was in unions. She worked in a cannery. Dad was a shearer. I know about the struggles and have experienced the struggles of, real regional people. And so people sort of think, well, why are you a Green? But because the principles that I learned on the farm are not that different from Green's ideals. We care about soil quality, about food production, about local jobs. We want to protect farmers from coal seam gas. We went out to Oakey last week and met with the farmers, people affected by PFAS, communities affected by fire ants. We have so many issues on the Downs affecting our farmland and our regional communities. And I am from those communities and I understand what it means to them. And so there's actually not that much difference between me and them. And so I feel like I can break down those stereotypes, those barriers, and we can talk about what matters. And no matter who wins, we should be all working together to look after our region. And it is things that matter to the economy. Farming matters. Our beautiful food production, for our hospitality industry. We're so known for it here, and we need to be looking after it.
Sure. Thank you for that, Alyce. Just switching gears now to, in those conversations that you've been having with voters, what have been the primary concerns that you've identified in Groom? And I'm talking about, obviously, those Groom-specific issues. And what would you like to do, and what will you do if you were elected into the seat of Groom?
Look, I think it's
really... them, I should say. Sorry.
Thanks, Tim. Look, I think this time has been really different. I've run for Groom before, but I've run a few times for the Greens in different seats. But people aren't necessarily coming up with a singular issue or a pack of issues. People are generally very upset. They're very disconnected. They feel unheard. And for the first time ever, they're undecided as to where their vote's going to go.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So they're not asking, usually you'd get a voter coming to you with an issue that they're really passionate about, something that affects them. But this time people are saying, what do you stand for? What is your platform? What is your policy? What are you going to do for us? And I think that that's really a change. So as much as I can say to you, I think it's cost of living, I think it's housing, I think it's, good quality medical care, all those sorts of things that affect me as a young mum, as a parent, as a young person trying to buy a house, which that's my demographic, obviously.
Sure.
I think the electorate has such vast issues, but they're not sort of saying, well, this is the thing. They are just generally very upset and feel unheard.
Gotcha.
And so for me, look, it's such, I never want to be that slogan politician, because that's not what I'm about, but I think it's going to take a lot of consultation, coming together and working together to fight for the things that Groom needs now and in the future. So I'm committed to doing all of that frontline revitalisation and assistance in our regional communities. But I think it's going to take a while to drill down and see just what Groom wants now and into the future.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you, Alyce. I want to talk about that cost of living question, because I think there's a lot to unpack there. But just on a brief aside, there's a lot of people in Groom who are keen on a fast rail from Toowoomba to Brisbane. Is that something that you'd be supporting? And if you do, how would you like to execute that?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, I'm so for connecting up our regions. I'm from New South Wales, where we actually do have some access to a rail service in the region. So it was a shock to come to Queensland and not have passenger rail. So look, the Greens are for affordable and accessible public transport. That's our goal. It's good for the environment. It's good for our communities. And so we're very much in support of good quality passenger rail. we would have to work closely with the federal and state governments to get that actually done. But yes, very much in support.
Exciting. Awesome. Thank you for that. Now, so switching gears now to that cost of living bit, specifically around the cost of utilities, groceries, and everyday living expenses. They're going up. People are feeling it, as you've said. What is causing those issues in your view? And at least from a Greens perspective, what are some of the levers that you can pull to bring those prices down?
Absolutely. Look, we know inflation is causing issues. We know that the tariffs from the US are going to make that even worse. But at the end of the day, it's also the big corporations. And that is our plan, to actually tax them properly at the rate so that we can afford the things that we need. But when we're talking about specific levers, oh, sorry, Tim.
No. Well, is it okay if we just talk about that for a second? Because I'm actually really curious about this, because something that, you know, a lot of, and I'm thinking about some of the independent senators like Gerard Rennick, who's been mentioning this sort of issue as well, where basically the current corporate tax rate that we have here is, I think, something between, and I'll correct this if I'm wrong in post in the description, but something about like 30% corporate tax rate. And so a lot of these businesses are basically setting up offshore marketing or business accounts, right, in Ireland or some other country that has a much lower tax rate, and then they're billing and invoicing the corporations here to say, oh, well, what a surprise, the marketing bill to use our logo cost X billions of dollars. Therefore, now everything's a loss. So all the money goes right off to there, much lower tax rate of 10% or something. Now, what's fascinating is that someone like Rennick, he's saying the solution to that is to lower our tax rate, so instead of them shipping off all of that tax money off, they're being more incentivized to pay not obviously as low as what Ireland can do, because that's not realistic, but one that is more stomachable for the corporates. So whereas from what I understood is that the Greens want to increase that. So in my mind, I'm thinking, how will the Greens achieve a higher corporate tax rate, which is already, and I mean, at 25-30% is already scaring off those businesses. How will you achieve raising that while actually maintaining that, while stopping them from doing that loophole where they're saying, I'm writing this off as a loss because of my marketing budget?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And thank you for explaining it so beautifully, because it is only all the minor parties and independents that are talking about this. It's a huge issue. You are spot on. You've explained it perfectly.
Thank you.
I think people think that we're going to raise it. We're not. We want them to actually just pay it. That's the problem.
Gotcha.
You've so beautifully identified it. Some of them are paying zero. Absolutely 0% tax in Australia, which is just, it's hard to even fathom that that's a loophole, that they're totally getting away with it. So we want to make sure we're shutting all of those loopholes and making sure that they actually pay their fair share. And look, we've run all this through Treasury. If they did just pay the basic rate that we've got it set as now, we could afford everything. It's all been costed. It is just making them accountable and actually paying our communities. And this did come up even when we went to Oki. Members of that community put it to our MP and the other candidates. Other countries collect their tax from their mining corps and actually put it to use. We've got nothing and we're not getting anything from it. And so people are understanding now, if we did actually get that, we could use it really, really well.
That's great. Yeah. And could you explain to me, you might not have the exact answers off the top of your head right now, but what would the Greens do to close those loopholes where they are, again, like they get an invoice from marketing in Ireland and it's 2.8 or 3.8 billion dollars, and then they go, whoops, we got to pay that invoice, and then we've lost all our money. How do you close something like that?
Look, Tim, I'm going to be completely frank and honest with you here. I'm not an expert at economics, and so I'm not exactly sure what those are, but I'm absolutely happy to take that on notice, because I'm sure people are very interested in what those loopholes are. But again, I'm not an economist or a lawyer. You
Got
know,
it.
that's not my background. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think just speaking candidly here, I think that there's like so many businesses do this to not it's not just an Australia problem. It's like it's in New Zealand, it's in Canada, it's in the United States themselves. That and plenty of governments have tried to solve it. So it is a big issue to address. But
Yeah.
also, I guess, from a free market side of things, and now again, this is not to say that it's a good thing that they're stealing this or they're not paying their fair share in tax,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's to say that if there is a business that all of a sudden now has to pay their fair share, which is their fair share, what they should be paying, they might even see Australia not as a good idea to keep investing in, and they may want to pull out of the market. So, and that could be a negative because we know that less competition means higher prices. When there's less businesses that are actively trying to innovate and create new products and services in the market, that actually does create a worse economy and a worse quality of life overall.
Mhm.
How would you strike that balance between encouraging business owners to innovate, to create, to keep building and expanding, while also making sure that they're paying their fair share of tax, in the sense that they pay that fair share, but there is a reward at the end of that for the hard work they've done to support the community?
Look, I'm going to be really, really honest here. It, that's not really the businesses that we're talking about. You know, medium and small business in Australia that is doing that work, holding our communities together and innovating, they're not going to be affected by this plan. We're talking about the mega corporations that they're earning in the millions and billions of dollars. And so for them to say to our government, oh, we haven't made enough profit, so we'll go overseas, is just ludicrous. I'll be honest, it's just ludicrous. They are, you know, earning more money than we could spend in a lifetime. So it is, you know, they can threaten that, but at the end of the day, if we're all working together to hold them to account, we're in Australia and through our trade partners, we could actually make sure that business is accountable for what they're doing.
Sure. Thank you for that. So I really appreciated that sidetrack. That was really interesting to me, and I appreciated hearing your perspective on that.
Mhm.
I wanted to switch briefly to nuclear. Now, is that a Greens policy to support nuclear, or are they typically, is it Greens policy to sort of stand against it?
Yeah, obviously we're anti-nuclear.
Sure.
We don't think that that's a sensible option, even though obviously it is a cleaner energy in its emissions. It's, you know, just not worth the damage that it can do. So no.
What sort of damage do you think that it could do compared to the damage that potentially solar, wind, or even coal is currently doing?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good question. Oh my goodness, sorry. I'll try and hang up this call. I cannot believe someone tried to ring me.
Oh, no, you're
Not
good.
really. I'll just sorry. Oh
You're
my
good.
I am in an interview. Sorry to make you have to edit this. Yeah. Okay.
All right,
Also,
cool.
I am sorry about that.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
I should have posted to my Facebook, do not call me for the next hour.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
Let's recalibrate.
So nuclear, that's the question.
Yes.
What sort of damage do you think that it's going to do to the environment that is worse than what solar, wind, or coal is currently doing?
Yeah. Well, obviously, firstly, it takes a significant amount of water, which we just don't have as a resource to just waste on that in Australia. So that would be the first part. Second of all, if we did see a meltdown like we saw in Japan in the past, then the damage to our soil, our air, our communities, it's just not worth it if something goes wrong. You know, the destruction, even though it doesn't happen very often, you know, the destruction when it happens is just not worth the risk. We don't want to be a nuclear dumping ground in Australia.
Okay, that's interesting because I know for a fact that Australia is not on a fault line, and it's, you know, in terms of relative safety from a meltdown, Australia is one of the safest places to do it. Do you think that there is, well, I'll ask it this way. Would you be supportive of at least lifting the ban on nuclear so that there can be a conversation about finding, because the thing is, right, the main thing that's stopping us from actually finding out what's the safest way to do this and what's the most cost-effective way to do it is that there is a total ban on nuclear. And
Mhm.
so would you be open to at least lifting the ban so that we can actually figure out, hey, is there actually something that we can do here? Is there some way that we could make this work?
Not at this stage, no. That's not our policy.
Sure.
We stand strong on that ban against nuclear because there is so many. And look, we know nothing's perfect. I think that's the biggest problem with this conversation. Everyone wants to go straight to, oh, but all renewable mining is dirty. Of course it's dirty, but so is coal and so is gas. And the destruction that those things do to our environment is so high. We need to be investing into, solar. It works really well with agriculture. It's actually, increasing yield in wool production and in vegetable production. There's many things that we can do that still work quite well, like solar, like wind, like hydro, as long as it's not destroying an actual environment, obviously, where we put in those things. Everything needs to be looked at case by case. But for now, with the technology that we have, we should be using the things that are at least the least harmful. There's not going to be no harm. We know that. We're not there yet, even though there's lots of innovation going into batteries and storage and, salt batteries and all of that stuff that I'm nowhere near an expert on. We have all of those methods coming up, but while we're still in transition, we should be using the better technology that we know works really well and making it more affordable for Australians to be able to use it at home. So making it cheaper to get solar, making it cheaper to have a battery bank at your house. It's all those sorts of things that we're in support of. So while no, we don't support nuclear, we do support making the individuals more able to access renewables, bring down their power bills, help with cost of living, and just improve the environment as well.
Sure. Thank you for that. Switching gears now to housing affordability. It's a
Mm-hmm.
complex issue, but what do you think is causing house prices to go up here, specifically in Groom, in Toowoomba, where the median house price has risen up to $604,400? Sorry, $604,400 in Toowoomba City.
Look, what we've seen since the beginning of COVID is essentially the house prices have tripled. And honestly, even though some of that is inflation, a lot of it is just pure greed. We have so many wealthy property investors getting so much benefit out of this. And while we do have a housing shortage, obviously on the Downs we have a 1% vacancy rate. Those numbers are just not realistic. It's astronomical. It's now honestly cheaper to buy a house than to rent one in some suburbs. So yeah, we've really got to work on ending the handouts to the property developers and things like we have to look at negative gearing and look at how we can bring down the costs not just for selling but also for renting. So our policy is to start a public developer so that we can build a great number of homes quickly and then not only rent them out to people at an affordable rate, but also sell them. So not just like a social home scheme. We want to be able to make sure that people can buy as well.
Sure. Okay. So I'm hearing, a public housing developer that's government controlled, government owned, in order to basically control these prices irrespective of the market, with houses that are more affordable.
Yes.
That's an interesting thing that I'm very curious to see how that could work, because there has been some countries that have tried that. The thing I guess I'm particularly interested in is that, because supply is a big issue, right?
Yes, it
There's
definitely is.
Yeah, and I think that the hard truth is, I suppose, yes, you probably would need to have a public housing developer that comes in tow with some of the policies that the Greens have, which include capping rent increases to 2% every year.
Mhm.
Just a wild host of these other issues, of
Mhm.
these other measures. Because in my view, if I'm a property investor, if I have a plot of land and I want to use my capital to build a multi-story unit, a big complex that houses multiple people,
Mhm.
there's probably only, like, in terms of being told, hey, if you sign up and start building this, the incentive for me to actually do it is pretty low, in terms of,
Mhm.
if I know that my rents, I'm not going to be able to increase my profits by 2%, like by more than 2% every year, despite potentially other costs like utilities, electricity, and other factors that could eat that up. But then let's say, and then on top of that, so all of a sudden you're in the red. But then
Mhm.
if negative gearing gets scrapped because you can't write off that red as a loss, then all of a sudden it's like there's very little incentive to get into the housing market, and I might be putting my money somewhere else. So I might be putting it into entrepreneurship. I might be putting that into overseas investments rather
Mhm.
than investing in building homes in Australia. So I guess what I want to know is, yes, I think that a public housing um, developer is a good idea in theory, but I don't think we would be able to spin up fast enough to build those homes, um, while where I'm looking at this issue and I'm seeing the fact that we've got all of these private privately owned housing developers out there, which I think there are some instances where there's obviously like money making that is immoral, but
Mhm.
there are some who are doing it right. And so in my mind is, I'm thinking, how do we make sure that these people who have been doing it for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years are incentivized to do it, while also, of course, addressing that issue of making sure that renters aren't being taken advantage of.
Look, Tim, the scales have tipped. I think that's the issue here. Okay.
Sure.
So I'm 40 in a couple of years. So I'm gonna tell my age. When I was growing up, renting, of course, is something that some people need, for whatever reason,
Sure.
mostly financial. Or people like me that have a disability that can't afford to buy it, or the elderly or whatever. So what we're seeing is that since John Howard came to power, it shifted from housing is something that most people can afford, but obviously you get your private investors, like you spoke of, that are doing the right thing. They're mum and dad investors. They have a couple of houses, or maybe even only two or three,
Mm.
and they're doing it as a community service for the right reason. They're not making a ton of profit off this. That's not the people that we're talking about. We're not going to affect those people at all with our plan. That is not who we want to apply these rules to. It's not for those people that are providing a service in our community. What we're trying to end is housing as an investment, as a
Sure.
huge money making investment. So if you look around the Downs right now, and I know because I'm currently moving, our lease is ending, we're looking for a new house. There are houses sitting vacant right now that have no one in them because the developers are just wanting to keep the price and the quality of the home as good as it is to sell it on. We have so many houses in my particular area that are investor owned. They own multiple in this area and they are just selling them, buying them like hotcakes. We are doing musical chairs, like literally musical chairs out here to stay in a house. It is absolutely ridiculous. This is this is a huge issue. This isn't just that, okay, well, only the private market can meet the needs of our community. It's actually jumped from only 20% of people renting to now 30 and 40% of people are renting. It's now an investment. It's not, it's not a human right anymore. It's not the dream anymore. We don't get to own our home anymore. It is just there for investment. So yes, that is actually what we want to encourage, to take that investment and put it in another market, not in something that is a human right. It's a roof over someone's head. There are
Yeah.
plenty of
Wow.
opportunities to invest in other things, not housing, and let Australians buy a home and live in a home.
Mm.
Of course, we don't want to completely see the end to landlords. Obviously, they have their place, But we don't want it to be that the instant thing that Australians invest in is housing. There are other things that they can invest in, not just housing.
Yeah.
Because it has changed. Our generation now can't get a house, whereas our parents, they all owned by now. They didn't have this issue. People that needed to rent could rent, but everybody else could buy, and they could actually have the stability of a home. And it's so personal for me right now because we've tried to buy, and have been beaten out because property investors can walk in with cash and they can pick up a house. They can offer well above what families in our region can afford to take it and lease it out. And so we're all left unable to get into the market. It's swung too far, Tim. It's not that we're saying no one can invest, but should we have people making mega money out of housing? And I say no. And that's what the Greens believe. We need to bring it back to centre, bring it back to how it was, not what John Howard went, well, you know what, let's invest in housing. That's a really safe investment, It's become the super instead of, a home.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, I think, like, just speaking candidly here, I think that one of the things I quite lament about the capital gains discount when it was introduced in 2004, 2005, I can't remember the exact year.
Yeah.
Is that it sort of divided Australia in half. Is that, well, not even half, but just from the haves into the have-nots in terms of renters all of a sudden were seen as lesser, perhaps, because once you've bought a home, then you see that as an investment and an ability to get a discount to use as leverage to buy the next home and the next home after that. And I think I tend to agree that I think there's something that needs to be done, like in that department. My concern really still lies in that idea, because from what I was reading just briefly up on the Greens policy, which, by the way, the website's super clean and it was really easy just to click around and find that stuff. And I got to tell you, like, not a lot of other parties have made websites as easy to read as the Greens, so I really appreciated that.
Thank you.
The thing I found interesting is that when it comes to I've got it up here on the side here, from what I understood, and I haven't read it deeply enough, is that you'd want to sort of tackle that negative gearing and capital gains discount for people who purchase more than one investment property. So is that right? So is it sort of saying, let's say you've somehow achieved the Australian dream. I mean, I'm blessed to have purchased my home here in Toowoomba, personally, like a couple of years ago, just when the house prices were marginally affordable for us, and now this place has doubled in property in value.
Oh, wow.
So, and I think that's crazy, but I would be able to purchase another home and still use my capital gains discount and negative gearing under the Greens. Is that correct? And then after that, then there wouldn't be allowed. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right, Tim.
Sure.
We're not stopping people doing what they need to do to be able to live their life. That's not what we're about.
Sure.
Everybody thinks that we're the party of government control, but actually we're the party that introduced a bill to stop gas companies coming onto farms. We're for the little people, we're for the community. So that's exactly spot on. That's my understanding of it as well. It's not going to stop you doing what you need to do, but it's to stop people just being able to continue on and just amass a huge portfolio. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. But I guess my main question mark there would be in the department of high density housing, because I think, like, I'm sure we both agree that high density housing is a great way to help bring the supply issue down a bit, where there are plenty of people, and I would say even boomers, who don't need as much space because of the high maintenance costs. Their bodies are getting weaker. Having a place like that is smaller, high density, I think that's a great idea to allow them to have that along with freedom. I'm a big proponent of having something like that in the CBD here in Toowoomba as well. But my thinking is, I really want to see more private developers set those up and make it clear and accessible and attractive for private developers to build those high density housing places. Because in my view, I'd prefer not the public developer to be shouldered with that burden because it is taxpayer money.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like if it has to happen, then if in a hypothetical where it's created, then it has to happen. But
Yeah.
I would love to see a private and public sort of hand in hand working together and building these things. But but again, for me, it's like if again putting myself in the boots of an investor, I'm
Mm-hmm.
seeing I'm going, okay, I have this big plot of land right near the CBD and I want to build like what 20, 30, 40, 50 homes like inside of this high density housing
Mm-hmm.
that will basically house hundreds of people and like dozens of families. But I'm being told that I can't increase the rent commensurate to the cost that I'm incurring. Plus, if I when I take a loss, I can't even write that off at tax time. Did you see how that could be like difficult to convince a private investor to put that in? Because I respect what you're saying. Like, yeah, go put the money somewhere else. We need to stop making housing an investment. But
Mm-hmm.
what about those people who have the ability, the expertise, and the knowledge to build high density housing? How do we make sure it's still a good deal for them that it does get built?
Yeah, look, I think you're absolutely right because what we're sort of mostly talking about is homes.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about. Families, our generation. But you've hit the nail on the head that there's a whole generation that are ready to downsize. And what we're hearing on the ground is that there's nowhere to go. We don't have those smaller, more accessible and affordable apartments and inner city living.
Yeah.
So I do agree with you. And I think you're right. Even though we really need a public developer, we also are going to still need some forms of private development or at least a collaboration,
Yeah.
between that. So look, we're always open to negotiating and changing because it is about finding the balance that is right and meets the needs of the community. And so we certainly would be wanting to fund those sorts of infrastructure projects that can house decent amounts of people. And so we've seen council investing into that with charities in Toowoomba, and we want to see more of that. But it is just about ending that just property for profits, mega profits sake. But yeah, I think it is, we're always agreeable to working on how do we get that balance right. And as I said before, it's just gone too far one way.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you, Alyce. I wanted to talk just briefly about so just to be clear, just from that supply issue, the Greens policy in summary is public housing developer working with the private sector to just build more homes, specifically build affordable homes that people can move into, they can own, they can start paying off, and that will essentially ease that supply issue. Is that right? Have I heard you correctly?
Yeah, that's right.
Great,
And also
awesome,
accessible housing as well.
accessible.
And our
Yes.
rent caps, because, when we first moved into our place here, it
Mm,
was just small rental increases that was in line with inflation.
yes.
And now people are getting 150 or $200 rent increases at the end of their lease, which just, yep, that is just outrageous.
I see. So I wanted to just talk about because we've spent a good amount of time on the supply issue, and I really appreciated that. And thank you for taking the time for letting me pick your brain on that. Um, but what about demand? What role does demand play in the housing crisis? And is there anything on the green side of things that will help reduce demand?
Oh, that's a tough one. Obviously, demand is a huge issue in our electorate. We've got a vacancy rate of less than 1%. So essentially, really, I mean, again, I'm not an expert on housing, but I think that probably just it is that trying to build as quickly as we can to get people, housed. That's really the only thing that I can think of right now that is the solution that I understand.
Sure, I see. So, I mean, because that's sort of the thing that's probably the big question mark that I don't think any of the major parties have really like effectively addressed or like talked about. Um, like in the past few years, especially in terms of immigration, like the Labor Party has let in, I think 1.4 million. Again, I'll get the number correct in post, but something around 1.4 million migrants into Australia. Now, the Labor Party at least with latest polls, seems like they're going to form another majority government, depending on how the election finally shapes up at the end of this. Even if they commit to building, saying 100,000 more homes, or 200,000 more homes, or 300,000, 400, 5, 6, 7, 800,000 more homes over the course of 10 years, if we're letting in these record numbers of migrants, these are people who need homes. In my mind, the math isn't adding up. I'm thinking that's more people in, and even if we've just here in Groom, if we've just built a few more homes, if we have another 6,000, 10,000, 20,000 migrants come into Toowoomba. And by the way, this is me speaking as the son of a migrant. My mother's from the Philippines, so this is not a race issue. This is not anything to do with that. It's specifically just a numbers game. Do you think that there's any room to adjust those numbers, or at least put a pause on those record high immigration numbers, so that we can get the housing crisis addressed?
Well, currently, no, we don't support any change to our immigration. Oh my goodness, Tim. I
Another
can't.
call?
Yeah.
You're a popular person, Alyce.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're all right.
I'll just message. Oh my goodness. You'll be upset that we did this on the.
No, it's totally fine. I should say that I made a promise to to all of the candidates that I won't edit any of the videos, so this will probably be left in, but people will understand. It's no big deal.
Okay. Okay, fantastic.
So just catching up to speed, you said it's not party policy to adjust any of the numbers when it comes to immigration.
No, that's correct. And look, I think it is about something that you touched on before, matching people with the right housing. We can actually make it so that we're housing people in a more effective manner. And let's use the homes that are currently sitting vacant, that are used as investment, get those houses filled first and go from there. There's lots that we can do without, pausing immigration.
Sure, appreciate that. Let's say, and I don't mean to harp on the issue, but is there a number, like, let's say the Greens there's a minority government that's formed, the Greens have a significant amount of influence, and the Labor Party continues the record high immigration numbers that they are bringing in. Is there a number that the Greens would recognise as, say, this is probably too high? This is probably where we're going to sound the alarm bell and say to the major party, we got to slow this down, man. And let's say you've got the public housing developer. Let's say we've got the rent caps. We're doing what we can to take the vacant housing and basically allow, say, baby boomers to have a smaller house that works for them, so that the families can move around, so our capacity is good. Is there a number where the Greens would say, we've got to slow this down, or else we're not going to be able to keep up with this?
Look, that isn't a conversation that I'm aware of. That would be, look, our party runs off consensus, and so we constantly update policy at all times with our membership. If a social issue or any issue comes up, it will come through that internal process within the party, and then it gets voted on. So if that did become an issue, then that would be up to the membership to decide, okay, is this something we need to take action on? Sure. So at this current time, that hasn't been something that's discussed, but it doesn't mean that it won't be discussed.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. So I guess the main Greens policy at the moment is the numbers have not been the main issue in terms of immigration. Yes. It's just supply, get supply down pat.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Awesome. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Now, I wanted to just quick question as well. Does the Greens want house prices to go down, or, as what the major parties have said, they want to keep it stable, and then boost wages to be able to afford it?
Look, of course, I think they do have to come down a bit. I think we're at a point when now people can't buy them. If people don't have a wage that can afford a house, then what's the point of the house sitting at that price? It's not working. Yeah. So yeah, of course.
Bring him down. Got it. Now switching gears to Indigenous issues, which I think is a big one here in Groom. The 2023's referendum to enshrine Indigenous voice to Parliament in Australia, in the Australian Constitution, went through back in 2023. Groom resoundingly voted no, with 76% 76.3% disagreeing with the proposal. Now, I'm aware that the Greens supported the voice to Parliament as an official policy. Did you align with that support personally? And in terms of how you want to address Indigenous issues here in Groom, how will you do that in a way that is, one, respective of the vote of what the majority of Groom has said, but while also actually speaking to these major issues that Indigenous peoples have raised?
Absolutely. Great question, Tim. While the Greens supported the voice, that's actually not our policy.
Oh,
So
sure.
we did support Labor on this, but again, it's not our policy. So our
Gotcha.
policy is truth, treaty, and then voice. So not exactly Labor's model of their voice to Parliament. So our pathway looks very different. It would be about truth telling and a treaty between First Nations people and Australia. And so it would be a longer consultative healing process between everyone. It would be a bringing together of the community, hearing each other's stories, breaking down barriers, getting things, set out and recorded. Like we saw the truth-telling inquiry here in Queensland started by the Labor government, which has just been shut down, unfortunately, by the Christopher government. And so, we want to do those things to begin that process of true reconciliation in Australia. So I feel like that model is respectful of everybody's, wishes, and it isn't just about a token voice. It is about true reconciliation.
Gotcha.
And there's things that we can do that aren't Parliament things to support our First Nations community. So, for example, they're affected by the mining and the fracking in our regional communities. They don't have access to good quality water or hospital or health services. Let's get back to basics and make sure that we're actually meeting the needs of First Nations, First Nations people in our community. And I'm actually really proud. I'm standing with Elizabeth Johnson for Maranoa. She's a proud First Nations woman as our candidate, who was a social worker out in Dalby for years, who works with her community. And she talks about the need for more domestic violence services for their communities, more appropriate services for their communities. And so we are very much for helping First Nations people here in Groom with the issues that matter to them. And I think that even people that voted no in the referendum, they would respect that work.
Sure. No, of course. And I appreciate what you've said there about listening to Indigenous voices, understanding where they're coming from, what they need, and trying to address those. In that same vein, would you support Jacinta Price's proposal for a royal commission into sexual abuse in Indigenous communities?
Look, on principle, of course, I support anything that looks at child abuse and neglect.
Sure.
But Jacinta, as a politician, is not being 100% honest here. I'm somebody that works around the space of disability, who, by the way, is a huge community that faces high rates of sexual abuse and violence in their community. And so I'm on the periphery of child protection spaces. There is no greater amount of children harmed in Indigenous versus non-Indigenous communities. In Queensland, Southwest here, our Southwest region, has one of the highest rates of children in care. So when we're looking at the real statistics, this is in every community. She's doing a disservice to her communities when she said, oh, it's just that. That's what we need to look at. No, Tim, that's not the truth. It is in every single community. It is at an epidemic level. We have record numbers of children in care in Queensland. And so I'm here to actually work on fixing that problem and actually preventing child abuse and neglect and sexual abuse of children. So, of course, I support any inquiry, but a real one, that actually doesn't just, use stereotypes around race to say, oh, that's only a problem here, when actually I know the problem's in our backyard.
I see. Yeah. So you don't think that the issues that she's raised in her lived experience in terms of her Indigenous community that she's seen, where she's anecdotally said that this stuff is higher than what she's personally seen in other communities. You don't see that playing out as truth in terms of what you're seeing.
Not as a disability advocate,
Hmm.
not as someone that does this for work. No, it's not correct. We have huge amounts of disabled children in care as well, not just First Nations children. This is a huge problem. It's not just in First Nations communities. And Australia isn't ready for the conversation that we have such high rates of abuse and neglect. And we have to work together to end that all together, not just throw around, it only happens here, not there. Child abuse happens in the most perfect looking homes, behind any door in our streets right now. And so, yeah, I support real action on this issue.
I see. Because I think, and I'm not going to speak for Jacinta on this side of things, but I am curious about what you have to think, like what your thinking is from at least the conversations that you've had with the member for Maranoa, where she's talked about domestic violence issues in Indigenous communities or First Nations communities. From what it seems like Jacinta's trying to get at is that there are these sort of systemic issues that are in the home of Indigenous communities that are leading to, like say, the gap between in education and employment outcomes and those sorts of quality of life outcomes that I think that every single Australian wants to see improved in the lives of Indigenous peoples across Australia. Do you agree that there's some truth in that space there, or is there some sort of like systemic racism or institutionalized power that's still oppressing Indigenous peoples and preventing them from succeeding?
Look, absolutely. I think you've summed it up in a much better way than Jacinta has. Of course, there is a gap with the care, the services, the support systems, and it does affect our regional communities too, not just our First Nations communities. But of course, there is a gap, and we do have to work on closing the gap and making sure that we can end all sorts of social issues within those communities. But it's just very disingenuous to say that it's only those communities. They suffer, obviously, the long-term effects of colonialism, of being displaced off country, of not having their ancestry known to them, all the effects of the stolen generation, things like that, obviously have affected their communities, and it's still affecting them now. And so obviously there's a lot of work to be done to fix those issues, to help. But it isn't just about, they abuse their children at higher rates. Yeah. That's just not the case. Yeah.
So the main thing you take issue with is the fact that it comes across as if she's saying that's the only thing that's at stake here and nothing else.
That's right.
Gotcha.
It's a whole host of things.
No, thank you for your perspective. I appreciate that, Alyce. I wanted to talk now about foreign policy issues, and this is actually one issue that is right on the front page of the Greens website, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. You will be the primary advocate to Canberra on all foreign policy issues. Now, while obviously you don't have the parliamentary power to choose to go to war, choose not to go to war, that's all right in the Prime Minister's hands. But with a large evangelical Christian population here in Groom, along with a growing Muslim community, where do you stand, both from a party and a personal perspective, on the war in Gaza? And what is your stance on what the Labor Party has done up to this point in terms of pursuing a ceasefire at the UN and preventing military aid from being sent to Israel?
Oh, thank you, Tim. You're the first person to actually ask us about this, and it's been the elephant in the room for the whole campaign. Obviously, I support an end to the genocide in Palestine. I want to see a ceasefire. That is the Greens policy. We've outlined what we think should happen to bring that about, but obviously we need to work together as a parliament to get this ceasefire done. And I don't know what more you can say. It's just we need to end the genocide in Palestine, and we need to take action on this.
Do you think the Labor Party's done enough to prevent the war in Gaza from escalating?
Look, it's such a difficult issue. I think Labor do want to end it, and they're trying, but I think we could take stronger stance. We could take a stronger stance against it. more sanctions, perhaps. There's got to be things that we can do to bring about the end to this war.
I appreciate that. And then just also asking about the war in Ukraine, because that's another big one.
Yeah.
Anthony Albanese mentioned about a month ago, like he floated the idea of potentially sending boots on the ground for Aussie troops in Ukraine. Do you support continuing to send funding to Ukraine? And would you be open to putting boots on the ground, Australian troops in the war?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. We have to provide material support to Ukraine, especially now the US is withdrawing their support for Ukraine. We need to make sure that they've still got that support. And look, we're not experts on this. Europe has a really good plan for being able to rebuild Ukraine, but I think it's on us now to support on the ground to be able to try and bring about an end to this war.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Now to switching gears to, you just mentioned the US, so this is perfectly timed. The relationship between China and the US, the tensions have been incredibly high over the past few weeks. Now, Australia, and to a more specific context, Groom has been caught in the middle of that.
Yes.
China accounts for 35% of our total exports. And here in Groom, we actually export billions of dollars of beef, cotton, barley, and timber to China. Now, if elected, I want to understand what your stance is on the US as being a military partner with Australia, how we've been with the AUKUS deal, getting these nuclear submarines, trying to strengthen that relationship from a military perspective. Is that something that you'd be keen on doing?
Yeah.
Or, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, or how do you intend to maintain a strong relationship with China in order to keep these exports going and feeding into the economy, specifically here in Groom?
I don't want to give you just a simple answer on this one, Tim,
I
but
know it's a big question, so yeah.
it's such a big question. But the Greens are the only party that supports ending the deal with the US. We want to, we want to take a much stronger stance against the US at this time, and obviously continue our wonderful relationship with China, even in such a tense and difficult geopolitical climate. It is one of our biggest, I know from living in Cambodia, one of our biggest exporters for our farmers here is Asia. And so we need to continue fostering, supporting, and strengthening our relationships. And perhaps we can even do more of that in the face of the tariffs coming out of the US. We need to be working together to protect our country, to have access to the things we need, and a strong export market for our manufacturing and our farmers as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Final question. So we've made it through all the questions. I know it's taken a little bit of time to get there, but I really appreciate the really well thought out answers that you've given here, Alyce.
Oh, thanks, Tim.
I want to know what your final message is to potential voters.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. I think I'm here to try and tangibly make people's lives better. That's why I'm an advocate. That's why I fight the NDIS for the disabled community. That's why I do the work that I do in Groom, because I just think that we need to be making sure people's basic needs are met, that we have world-class hospital and health and care services here in the Downs. We shouldn't be travelling anywhere to get the things that we need. We should be able to have a house and afford our bills and our GP visits, and be able to go to the supermarket and not get broke because we bought cheese and fruit in the same day.
Sure.
I don't want to sound frivolous, but they are the things that are affecting Australians right now. People are stressed, they can't pay their bills, and I just want to give people the relief to be able to have some joy in their life and have their needs met. So I just want the viewers to know that I will fight for Groom and everything it deserves.
Great. Alyce Nelligan, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tim.